Hey there, folks. Welcome back and on to our reading on political executives. And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We will recognize the differences between head of state and head of government. We'll identify the different forms of executives. We'll identify how executives in authoritarian states face fewer constraints than those in liberal democracies. We'll discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the U.S. presidential system, and we'll discuss advantages and disadvantages of the parliamentary executive. Okay, well, some key terms that we need to be familiar with as we discuss the political executive. First of all, the term executive itself, we're talking about the political institution, or in the case of the United States, the branch of government responsible for overseeing the execution of laws and policies. It's most often associated with the image of national leadership. The head of state is a figurehead role. The United States, we combine the head of state with the real power, our chief executive. We combine those both into the presidency. But other countries, they separate them. And that could be an elected or appointed president that is more ceremonial. In the case of, for example, the United Kingdom, they have a monarch that is inherited. In either of those examples, the real power is not with the head of state. They serve in a ceremonial function. They host state dinners. They might present official awards in the name of the state. You know, in the case of the Queen of England, she might be the one to knight people when they have achieved the honor of knighthood, for example. The head of government is where the real power of office is. This is the elected leader of government. They either represent a majority of folks in Parliament as the Prime Minister, or they're separately elected, as we do in the United States when we elect the President of the United States, which is a separate branch of government. And again, a constitutional monarchy is an example of a democracy headed by a monarch, but the monarch's power is limited by the constitutional rules. And that's what we see in the United Kingdom. Well, if you live in the United States, like I do, you live in a presidential executive system where the executive branch and the legislative branch are separate, and they're separately elected, and they have separate powers and responsibilities. And in the case of the United States and countries that have similar constitutional structures, they have the power to check each other. Limited presidential executive is one where the executive's powers are limited by the Constitution and political reality. So we have a limited presidential executive in the United States. An unlimited presidential executive would be what you'd find in authoritarian regimes or in dictatorships. Again, a central theme or a central principle that is associated with limited presidential executive systems is the separation of powers, where the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive branch all have the power to check each other. They have a complementary set of powers. In some cases, those powers do overlap. And if done correctly, they can have the opportunity to govern together. Of course, sometimes you reach a point, as we are in the United States today, where they are deadlocked, where there's gridlock between the branches of government, and it's difficult for them to get things done. Okay, let's spend a little bit more time with the limited presidential executive. In the limited presidential executive, elected presidents steer the government. They make senior level positions as to who will run the executive bureaucracy. In the United States, those senior level appointments are called cabinet positions at the highest level. And so the President of the United States will appoint those, and then they're confirmed in the United States Senate. And they're folks like the Attorney General or the Secretary of Defense and so on. In limited systems, the president serves a fixed term, and they're separate from the legislature. There's separate elections from the legislature. The legislature does not have the power to bring down the president under ordinary circumstances. So in a parliamentary system, at any given point, a prime minister could lose the support of a majority of parliament. They would be subject to a vote of no confidence, and then they would no longer be the prime minister. Potentially new elections would be called, and somebody else would emerge out of the legislature to serve the role of prime minister. Not so in a presidential system where the president is elected for a fixed term. They get to serve that term, even if they become unpopular with the country as a whole or with the legislature. Again, presidents they usually are allowed to serve fixed terms, and in some places they're allowed to run for re-election. In some countries like Mexico, they can only run once. And, other countries will allow a president to run perhaps for 2 terms in a row, but if they take a break, they can come back and run again in the future. In the United States, the limit by constitutional amendment is a total of 2 terms, 2 4-year terms. Again, there's very little overlap between the executive branch and the legislative branch. In fact, they have the power to oversee each other, the power to check each other. And if the President of the United States wants to appoint somebody from the legislature to serve as a cabinet secretary, they need to leave Congress in order to do that. That's not the case if you look at a parliamentary system where the leaders that join the prime minister in forming a government, they will continue to serve in the parliament while they run the government. In presidential systems, often, as in the case of the United States, the president serves both as the head of government or the chief executive, as well as the head of state, the ceremonial role of government. So they also host state dinners and present the Presidential Medal of Freedom and do some of the ceremonial roles that the president's responsible for. In the United States, of course, we have a vice president. So in many cases, the president of the United States will delegate some of those ceremonial tasks to the vice president to carry on those things. So some of the examples we see of limited presidential executives around the world, Afghanistan, at least in how it's designed. Of course, it's a new democracy, a fledgling democracy, so the system is not as stable as you'd see in the United States. Indonesia, which has seen democratic backsliding in recent years. Nigeria, the Philippines, which has seen democratic reversals in recent years. The United States, of course, and much of Latin America, Central and South America are presidential systems in the mold of the United States. So we see more parliamentary systems in Europe. We see more parliamentary systems in Asia. We see more presidential systems in the Americas. Of course, that's not entirely the case. We do see presidential systems also in Eastern Europe. So that's sort of an overview. I've alluded to this already, but in a parliamentary executive system, the executive comes out of the legislature. There's no separation, remains accountable to it. So if at any given point a prime minister loses the support of a majority of the legislature, they could suffer a vote of no confidence and no longer be the prime minister. So on any given day, a prime minister could lose their job as the chief executive, as the head of government. A cabinet, as in a presidential system, are those folks that run major government departments. The difference is that a cabinet in a parliamentary system is more powerful because they represent the coalition of parties that are running the government. And in most cases in parliamentary systems, a single party doesn't run the government. They are coalitions of parties. They are a partnership where a prime minister is able to be selected, a government is able to be formed based on multiple parties that represent a majority of the parliament or the legislature. All right, well, I don't want to repeat myself here, but a prime minister is the head of government in a parliamentary system. We also refer to them as a chancellor or a premier in some countries. And in most cases, they represent a coalition of parties, a group of partnering parties that represent a majority of the parliament. Governments, again, in executive system, in parliamentary systems, the executive branch is not separate from the legislature as they are in presidential systems like the United States. So the prime minister emerges from the parliament and they are selected by a coalition of parties within the parliament. At any given point, they could potentially lose their job if they no longer enjoy the support of a majority of parliament and they suffer a vote of no confidence. That is, most folks decide that they no longer support the prime minister and their government and want to hold elections and potentially select a new prime minister and a new government. Executives may serve an unlimited number of terms in office. There is a rule that elections have to be held within certain periods of time, and that varies by country. That could be once every 5 years. But again, at any given point, a prime minister may suffer a vote of no confidence and new elections would be called. The government and parliamentary systems have a degree of latitude as to when they want to schedule elections, and in many cases will do so in a way that's favorable to them. In some cases, you will see somebody serve as prime minister. They will either lose an election or suffer a vote of no confidence, no longer be the prime minister, and maybe it'll go 5 years, and then they'll again be selected as prime minister down the road. So executives in these systems serve an unlimited term of a number of terms for office, and in many cases may be selected as a prime minister and again lose a vote of no confidence, and then years later be again selected as prime minister. The executive branch in this sort of system is more collegial. It tends to be more cooperative. Otherwise, you are going to lose your governing majority. Also, members of the cabinet, also sometimes referred to as a council of ministers, these are folks that represent the different parties within the governing majority. And so, unlike in the United States, a president can hire and fire members of the cabinet. They serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. That's the president's prerogative. Not so in a parliamentary system. If there's division within the cabinet, it could be that the party that's represented by that cabinet minister would no longer support the prime minister. So it needs to be much more cooperative, much more collegial. People need to get along. The prime minister is the head of government. And in many cases, in most cases, when it comes to parliamentary executives, there is a separate ceremonial head of state. So there's the Queen of England. The Queen of England, of course, is not only the ceremonial head of state of the United Kingdom, but also Canada and New Zealand and other former British colonies. Some other examples of parliamentary executives that we see them throughout Europe and the Caribbean. I mentioned New Zealand already, but we also see Australia, India, Iraq, Japan, Pakistan. These are countries that run with a parliamentary system. Now, some countries have decided to split the difference between these two systems and have a strong, popularly elected president and also a strong parliament that names a prime minister, and a prime minister emerges from a coalition that represents the majority of the legislature. France is a great example of this that we see in the world today. Now, in many cases, both the president and the prime minister reflect and represent the same party or parties. And in that case, it's a pretty, straightforward process. They're in general agreement on public policy and the direction that the country should take. In those situations, too, the president will appoint a prime minister as long as they enjoy a majority of support in the parliament. However, there are some situations where the prime minister and the government that emerges from the legislature they represent a different group of parties than does the president. And in this situation, we call that cohabitation, where there's a split in party control between the presidency and the parliament. And then I think you can see that's when things get a little bit murkier. Historically in France, we saw that the president would deal much more with foreign policy matters and sort of matters that related to national defense and security, and the prime minister would deal more with internal matters. But due to globalization and the emergence of the European Union, it can be a lot harder to distinguish what are things that are foreign policy or external matters and internal matters. So there's kind of a blurring of the lines there. The president in these systems, as in presidential systems, serves a limited number of fixed terms. Likewise, the prime minister in such situations might serve multiple terms as long as they're enjoying the support of a majority of the legislature. The president in this situation, as in the United States, serves as the head of state as well and serves that ceremonial role like we see in the United States, but shares the role of head of government with the prime minister. So some examples in the world today against the best known is France, but also Mongolia, Poland, Russia. Now Russia, that's the way their constitution is set up, that they're supposed to have a strong president and a strong prime minister. That's not the way it actually works, that Vladimir Putin has amassed all that power. So yes, there is an independent legislature. Yes, there is a prime minister, but they serve, they are subservient to President Putin. Iraq isn't listed here, but they also have a plural executive system, prime minister, president, multiple vice presidents. There are a number of others. This is a chart from your reading. I'm not going to go over it, but it's good side by side when it comes to the presidential, parliamentary, and semi-presidential system. So spend some time with this so that you understand the differences. And then as you're reading for your analysis papers and you're looking at news items, I hope in the back of your head you'll think about, oh, this is the presidential system. Oh, this is more of a parliamentary or a semi-presidential system. Now, in authoritarian states, we see unlimited presidential executives. Okay, they're not checked by a constitution. There isn't a meaningful check with other branches of government. So the judiciary, the legislative branch, they probably exist, but there is always the potential for a political override. The president has the real power, and so that's why I refer to this as an unlimited presidential executive. And in many cases, this is synonymous with dictatorship. Also, you know, they may have a constitution that outlines that there's supposed to be an independent judiciary. There's supposed to be an independent legislature. Maybe there's supposed to be a federal system where power is divided between regional governments and the central government. Russia would be an example of that. But I think we would still refer to Russia as an unlimited presidential executive because even though their constitution says that those limits should exist, Vladimir Putin does not recognize or accept those limitations. And this, another word for this is a dictatorship, you know, where, you know, the leader represents a group of ruling elite and they repress other areas of government and certainly the society as a whole. Okay, to sum up, the political executive is responsible for setting priorities, mobilizing support, resolving crises, making decisions, and overseeing the implementation of policies. Executives may function as a head of state or head of government or both. So a head of state being more of a ceremonial role, head of government really actually running the government and the bureaucracy. In some countries they're combined like the United States, and in other countries they're divided like the United Kingdom and the division between the Queen of England and the Prime Minister that you see there. Presidential executives come in many different forms. It's usual for power to be shared between a presidency and other branches of government. And of course, in the United States, there is checks and balances between those. There is a separation of powers between our branches of government. Not one of them has the power, at least in design, to completely dominate the other branches of government in the United States. In parliamentary systems, on the other hand, the power of the executive depends heavily on the balance of power in the legislature or parliament. And at any given point, they could lose a majority of support in the parliament, they could lose their coalition of political parties, and they could lose power. So a prime minister on any given day could suffer a vote of no confidence and no longer be the prime minister, and new elections would need to be called. Semi-presidential systems combine both, presidential executive and a prime minister that emerges from the legislature. Executives in authoritarian states, they call themselves a lot of different things. They might call themselves a premier. They might call themselves a chairman. They might call themselves a president. But, you know, if you actually take a look at how they govern, they are not subject to checks by other branches of government, other aspects of government. There's always the potential for a political override. They serve underneath the authoritarian leader. They serve underneath the dictator. And even though they may have a perfectly wonderful constitution, those constitutional checks are not observed. All right, here are your guiding questions for the week. They will also be posted in the weekly discussion area. One substantive original post and at least 2 responses to your classmates' post to get a perfect score for your weekly participation. Again, drawing concepts from the reading, examples from the reading. Make sure that you have something to add when you're responding to the post of other students, that you're moving that conversation forward. As always, please reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns regarding your progress in the course. And of course, I look forward to meeting with you during Zoom office hours. Have a great week.